Daniel Osei was 38 years old when the woman he had bathed, dressed, fed, and carried through 3 years of paralysis looked up at him from her wheelchair in front of her sister and her mother and her two closest friends and said, with a calm that suggested she had rehearsed it, "He's not my husband anymore. He's just my servant." For 7 years before the accident, Daniel had been the kind of husband that other women pointed to when their own marriages disappointed them. He drove Camille to her physical therapy appointments on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before his own workday started. He modified their Philadelphia row house himself, widened the door frames, installed the grab bars, rebuilt the shower, lowered the kitchen countertops, spending 14 weekends doing the work a contractor would have charged him $60,000 to complete. He learned to administer her medications. He learned to track her autonomic episodes. He slept with the baby monitor on his nightstand for 2 years so he would hear her if she needed him in the night. He had done all of this without complaint, without audience, without anyone telling him he was supposed to. She had no idea that the morning she said it, a Sunday in October, with the autumn light coming through the living room windows and 5 witnesses sitting in their chairs. Daniel had already met twice with an attorney named Sylvia Crane, had already begun the paperwork, and had already arranged to move out the following Friday. He had been quiet about it because he was quiet about everything, and because the decision had not required drama to become final. What Camille called servitude, the law was about to call 17 months of documented spousal care contributions, and Sylvia Crane was very good at math. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The accident happened on a Friday evening in November. 3 years before the Sunday she used the word servant. Camille had been driving home from a dinner with friends on the 76 westbound, and the driver, who had fallen asleep, drifted across 2 lanes and hit her passenger side at 61 miles per hour. The impact fractured her T6 vertebra. She was in surgery by midnight and in the ICU by 3 a.m. Daniel got the call at 11:47 p.m. It was at the hospital in 22 minutes, still in the clothes he'd been wearing when he'd kissed her goodbye at 6 that evening. She was in acute care for 6 weeks, inpatient rehabilitation for 4 months after that. Daniel drove to the rehab facility every day after work and stayed until visiting hours ended. He met with her medical team on Thursdays when they had their weekly discharge planning meetings and took notes in a small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. He learned the names of every nurse on her floor. He brought Camille food from the Thai place she liked on Fridays because she hated the facility food and because the one thing he could control was whether she ate something that tasted like home. He was a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Center City. He had been there 11 years and was 3 months from making partner when the accident happened. He called his managing director the Monday after and explained the situation. His director, a pragmatic man named Stuart, told him to take whatever time he needed and to let them know week by week. Daniel took 4 weeks of FMLA and then came back part-time for 2 months, working from the hospital some days, from home on others, reviewing drawings and attending video calls from a chair in Camille's room while she slept. He made partner in March, 7 months after the accident, because the work had been done and Stuart was the kind of man who did not let a personal crisis erase a professional record. Daniel thanked him and went home and made dinner and gave Camille her 8 p.m. medications and did not mention it to her until she asked, 2 weeks later, what was new at work. She was not the same after the accident. He understood this. The literature he'd read, the social worker he'd spoken with, the support group he attended 3 times before the schedule became impossible. All of it said the same thing. Catastrophic spinal injury reshapes personality and selfhood. And grief at that scale does not move in a straight line. He gave her that. He gave her all of it. It gave her the anger that came out sideways as impatience, the fear that came out as contempt, the grief that arrived as withdrawal. He absorbed what she directed at him and did not take it personally because he had decided not to. And Daniel, when he made a decision, held it with both hands. The row house modifications took the first summer. He sourced the materials himself, watched tutorials, consulted with a contractor friend named Ade for the structural questions, and did the physical work on weekends, while Camille stayed with her mother. He widened the primary bathroom door frame and the bedroom door frame. He installed the ceiling track system in the bedroom that the occupational therapist had specified. Avery built the shower from scratch. New pan, new bench, fold-down seat, handheld fixture, grab bars at 3 heights. He lowered the section of kitchen counter where Camille liked to work, installed a pull-out shelf at her seated reach height, and retrofitted the lower cabinets with soft-close hinges so she could manage them independently. He built a ramp for the front steps, pressure-treated lumber with a non-slip surface he applied himself. He painted the whole thing to match the house. The contractor friend looked at it when it was done and said he wouldn't have done it any differently. Camille came home in August. She moved through the modified house in her wheelchair and said it was fine. And Daniel understood that fine was the best she had available that day, and he did not press for more. The first year was the hardest by the honest measure of anyone who goes through something like this. There were good days, afternoons where she laughed at something on television, mornings where she was present in a way that felt like her, evenings where they sat on the lowered back porch he built and talked like they used to talk, easy and directionless. And there were days that were not good, where everything he did was insufficient, where the weight of what her life had become settled on her like something physical, and she had nowhere to put it except at him. It did not leave. He had not considered leaving. He had married her for reasons that did not come with conditions, and a spinal cord injury was not a condition he had attached to those reasons. He was her husband. He did what husbands do when something happens that neither person chose. The second year was different. The acute grief softened into something more chronic, and the chronic version had its own texture. Camille had good function from the waist up and was fiercely capable in ways that impressed her therapists and frustrated her in the ways that capable people are frustrated when a portion of their capability is simply gone. She returned to her work as a graphic designer from home, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. By the second year, she had rebuilt a client base and was billing close to her pre-accident income. Daniel watched this and felt something he recognized as pride. What Hay also watched, more slowly and without naming it, was a change in how she spoke to him. It began as efficiency, clipped requests rather than full sentences. The social niceties stripped out because they required energy, and there was not always energy to spare. He understood this. He accommodated it. Then the efficiency became something else, harder to name, somewhere between impatience and dismissal. She began correcting him in front of her friends. His word choice, his phrasing, the way he described events at dinner parties they held at home. She began referring to things he handled as tasks rather than as contributions. He organized her medical appointments, and she called it administrative. It drove her to events, and she called it scheduling. She started a sentence once in front of her sister that began, "Daniel handles all the logistics," in a tone that made logistics sound like the job description of a particularly forgettable employee. Ed noted it. He said nothing. He kept his notes in the same spiral notebook he'd had since the rehabilitation facility, adding to it not out of strategy but out of habit. It was a man who documented things, who believed that the record was the thing you returned to when memory got slippery. Ed noted dates and statements in context. He did not know, at that point, that the notebook would matter. The sister's name was Renee. Renee had been at every significant moment of the previous 3 years, at the hospital the first night, at the rehabilitation facility on weekends, at the row house through the months of modification, bringing food and sitting with Camille on the afternoons. Daniel was at work. Daniel liked Renee. She was direct and warm, and had an engineer's practicality that he recognized and respected. He had thought, for 2 years, that Renee was on his side. He revised this in the second year, when he began to notice that Renee's visits coincided with the evenings Camille was sharpest in her criticisms, as if the presence of an audience refined them. He revised it further when he overheard a phone call, Camille's side of it, from the kitchen, in which Camille said, "He thinks he's doing me a favor," and Renee's laughter was audible from the receiver. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after the call ended. He poured a glass of water. He drank it. He rinsed the glass and set it on the rack. He was direct with himself, in the privacy of his own thinking, in a way he was never direct with anyone else about it. He was not leaving because she was paralyzed. He was not leaving because the marriage had become difficult. He was leaving because the person across from him had decided at some point he could not precisely locate. That his care was owed rather than given, and that owed things do not require acknowledgement or gratitude. or basic consideration for the person providing them. A was leaving because he had spent 3 years giving everything he had to a marriage that had come to regard him as furniture. These were different reasons. He held the distinction clearly. A made an appointment with Sylvia Crane in September. Sylvia handled complex divorce cases with a specialty in long-term care contributions. A niche, she explained at the first meeting. That had expanded significantly as the population aged and as more spouses found themselves in exactly Daniel's position. She was 54, compact, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a manner that suggested she had heard everything and been surprised by very little of it. She reviewed Daniel's documentation, the notebook, the medical records he'd kept, the receipts for the house modifications, the timesheets he'd maintained recording his hours of direct care, with the concentration of someone assembling a structure she'd built many times. "You kept timesheets," she said, looking up. "I'm an engineer," Daniel said. "I keep records of everything." Sylvia looked at him for a moment. "This is the most organized file I've received in 6 years of practice." She set down the papers. "You've documented approximately 4,200 hours of direct spousal care over 31 months. At a skilled home care rate of $32 an hour, that's just over $134,000 in contributed services. The home modifications, which you completed yourself and documented with receipts, add another $58,000 in conservatively appraised value. The total caregiver contribution claim, under Pennsylvania's equitable distribution framework, is well over $200,000. Daniel asked how long the process would take. Sylvia sighed she'd aim for mediation before litigation, and that mediation typically resolved in 60 to 90 days from filing. She said the filing could happen whenever he was ready. Ed told her he needed 2 more weeks. He spent those 2 weeks finishing a project he had been working on quietly for several months. A detailed bound document he had put together himself, the way he put together everything. Measured and precise. It contained the complete record of his caregiver contributions, the timesheets, the medical records, the modification receipts, the prescription logs, the mileage records from 412 driving appointments, the cost of the adaptive equipment he had researched and purchased, the documentation of the 3 occupational therapy programs he had coordinated and transported her to and from. He had it bound at a print shop on Walnut Street. 2 copies. He gave one to Sylvia and kept one in the fireproof lockbox in his office closet, behind the file of structural drawings for the Garfield Street project. The Sunday in October was not supposed to be the day. It was a gathering Camille had organized. Her mother, her sister Renee, and 2 friends from her graduate school years. A standing monthly lunch she hosted at the house. Daniel had cooked the food that morning. A spread she'd requested. Jollof rice, fried plantains, a pepper soup he'd learned to make from a YouTube series 2 years ago because it was the one she asked for when she was low. He had set the table, helped her with the transfer to her event wheelchair, which was lighter and more presentable than the daily one. Anne had been planning to spend the afternoon at his office reviewing drawings while they visited. Ed was at the kitchen counter packing his work bag when he heard Camille's voice shift into the register she used when she was performing. He stopped moving. He listened. She was telling a story about something that had happened the previous week. A misunderstanding about a medication pickup. A moment where Daniel had gotten the pharmacy timing wrong and she'd had to wait an extra hour for a prescription. He had apologized. He had fixed it within the hour. She was telling it as the story of a man who could not be trusted with basic tasks. Her mother said something sympathetic. Renee said something that drew laughter from the group. And Camille said it, clearly without heat, in the tone of someone stating the self-evident. "He's not my husband anymore. He's just my servant." More laughter. Warm, inclusive, the laughter of people who have been told the punchline and found it correct. Daniel zipped his work bag. He picked it up. He walked to the living room doorway. The 5 of them looked at him. Camille first, then the others in sequence. The laughter ending in the way sound ends when a room realizes it has been overheard. He looked at Camille for a moment. Not with anger, not with hurt, at least not the visible kind. He looked at her the way he looked at a structural drawing when he'd found what he was looking for, with the particular stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. He sighed, "I'll be at the office. I'll be back by 6. He walked out. He closed the front door behind him. He went to his car, A 2018 Honda Accord with 94,000 miles and a long scratch along the rear quarter panel he'd been meaning to touch up for a year. He put his bag in the passenger seat. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he started the car and drove. He called Sylvia from the parking garage. He told her he was ready. She sighed she'd file by end of week. He thanked her and hung up and sat in the parking garage for another 2 minutes, engine idling, before he drove out into the afternoon. The filing reached Camille's attorney, a man named Gordon Marsh, recommended by Renee, on a Thursday. Gordon called Camille that afternoon, and she called Daniel that evening. And he listened to her voice on the phone, which was not the performing voice, and not the servant voice, but something rawer and less certain. She sighed she needed to understand what was happening. He said Sylvia could direct all communication. He said he hoped she was well. He meant it. He ended the call. The mediation was scheduled for a Monday in December, in a neutral office in Old City. Gordon Marsh had reviewed Daniel's bound documentation by then. I'd consulted with a specialist in caregiver contribution claims and had advised Camille on what the numbers meant. She arrived at mediation quieter than Daniel had seen her in a year. Her mother was not with her. Renee was not with her. It was just Camille, in her daily wheelchair, and Gordon, and across the table, Daniel in his dark blazer and Sylvia with her reading glasses on a chain. The mediator walked through the framework. Sylvia presented the caregiver contribution claim, $134,400 in documented direct care hours, $58 million in home modification contributions, plus the standard equitable distribution of the marital assets. She was precise and unhurried. She cited the statute numbers. She referenced the case law. Gordon asked for a short recess. When they came back, his posture had changed. The settlement took 3 hours. Daniel received a cash payment of $195,000 from the refinanced home equity, a figure that reflected the care contributions and the modification value minus the standard marital assets Camille retained. He received a formal acknowledgement in the signed agreement of the documented care he had provided. This was not standard. Sylvia had insisted on it. Daniel had let her. He signed the final page at 2:14 p.m. He capped his pen. He straightened the papers into a neat stack and pushed them across the table. He stood. He looked at Camille. She was looking at the table. He did not say anything that required her to respond. He picked up his portfolio and walked out. He had arranged to rent a furnished apartment in Fishtown while he looked for something permanent. It was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the neighborhood rooftops and good morning light on the east side. He moved his things on Friday. 4 boxes and a duffel bag and the small framed photograph of his parents he kept on his desk. He unpacked methodically. He arranged the kitchen. He made the bed with the spare set of linens he'd brought. He stood at the east window for a moment and looked at the rooftops. He was not glad about what had happened. He was not bitter about it. He was something more honest and less dramatic than either of those things. He was a man who had given everything he had to something that stopped receiving it in good faith, and who had documented his way out of it with the same precision he brought to every structure he'd ever been responsible for. On Saturday morning, he made coffee, filled his thermos, and drove to a site in Kensington where his firm was consulting on a school renovation. He walked the perimeter before the crew arrived. He found a drainage issue in the northeast corner of the site plan that the original engineer had missed. He marked it with orange chalk. He left a note clipped to the foreman's board. He drove back to Fishtown. He parked. He sat for a moment in the quiet with the engine off, listening to the sound of the neighborhood coming awake around him. The engine ticked as it cooled. He got out of the car. He went upstairs. He made breakfast. He opened his laptop and began reviewing the drawings for the next phase of the Kensington project. His pen moving in the margin, his handwriting small and precise and completely his own. He had never needed anyone to see who he was. He had only ever needed to be it. The rest would take care of itself, the way structures do when the foundation has been built correctly, quietly, reliably, and without announcement. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that required it. He hoped you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.